if we have good jaw strength through chewing and playing with appropriate objects and talking and singing and cooing and babbling and all of that, then this jaw stability is going to help literally support all of this other healthy growth and development. But the key is that chewing must be taught.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, but here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, so let's get started.
One of the most frequent surprises a new mom or a mom of a new toddler will often say to me is, I had no idea I had to teach chewing. And I think 9 out of 10 parents out there just automatically think that chewing comes naturally, that it's part of our DNA. And there is a thread or two of truth in that, because we do have certain reflexes in our oral cavity, in our mouth, and throughout our body that helps get us through this kind of initial baby life. But it's important that all the parents understand that we have to teach them. And I think in this modern day world, with all of our packaged foods, and I'll talk about that, and our easy, quick meals really have contributed significantly to this epidemic that we have with picky eaters, selective eaters, poor speech development, health problems, attention issues. They're all woven together. So let's start with the basics, and then we'll move through the mechanics of teaching your baby how to chew and the benefits, the positive outcomes, and the easier it will be to get through this toddlerhood and into preschool and really create a healthy love for eating and building a healthy relationship with food. Okay, so what are the basics? I've said this before with other eating videos and podcasts, that when we introduce solids to our babies at 6 months of age, it's just that. It's an introduction. And that we have to really respect your baby is exploring all of these new items that you're supplying for them. And there's a lot of trial and error. And it's really important that we give them everyday opportunities starting around 6 months of age to experience what this food is and how I bring this to my mouth, how I chew it, how I swallow it. And it does not happen automatically. Their interest, partly because it smells good, it looks good, you're enjoying it, and it's the social driven interest. But also, they don't know what to do with it because they don't have the motor skills yet, the gross motor and the fine motor. Remember that the gross motor skills, the ability to sit up and hold themselves and to move their arms separate from their torso, to reach and grab things, whether it's a toy object or a chewy toy or food, and bring it to their mouth. And that communication between the hand and the mouth is critical. So let me run through some basics and then we'll get to the mechanics. I want to really strongly encourage each and every one of you to limit the purees. And we'll talk about why, because what's happened over the last 50 years with the types of food that we present to our babies and our toddlers. But perhaps the only puree that could be part of a nice healthy diet or food plan is a better phrase, I think, is that whole fat, unadulterated, without any flavors or sugaring yogurt. And if you're concerned in those first few months, 6 to 12 months, that perhaps cow milk might not be a good introduction, you can always go to coconut yogurt or sheep or goat yogurt, because there's some really great plain, no sugar, no fruit. They don't need that. Okay. And we'll talk in another episode, the pros and cons of your food choices. But right now we're looking at the texture, and we want to build up chewing. So pureed food doesn't really require chewing. But one thing that you can do is either use a baby spoon or a chewy toy, and he or she, your beautiful baby, can dip it in that pureed yogurt and chew on the toy, and he's getting flavor and he's getting some smooth texture until he really begins to learn how to use that spoon. And in the beginning of this introduction to solids, one program is called baby-led weaning, and I've talked about that before, and I really support that, and I think it's a great plan, great framework. I'm learning how to tweak it and individualize it a little bit more, but in the beginning, pureed baby foods are not necessary, because it's a slippery slope that this modern world has pushed upon us, and it extends that introductory phase, which should only be a few weeks or a few months, depending on the child, but 6 months to 9 months, that whole introduction where they're exploring different tastes, they're exploring different textures, and they're really getting the idea of what that bite and chewing and swallow is. And it's really important. And as I've always said here, chewing or learning how to eat and learning how to talk are two sides of the same coin. So the other reason that I'm encouraging strongly parents to skip the store-bought pureed foods is because those companies, Gerber's mostly, and if you do a little history on them, they're not necessarily in it for your healthy baby, but it's highly processed, way too much sugar. It's very addicting. And as I said, the way that our lifestyle is now, we tend to stay in that pureed stage much too long. And the companies know it. What did they invent 8 years ago? Pouches. And so now not only is a baby pushing pureed foods into early toddlerhood, right? 6 months into a year, into 8 months or 18 months. But now they're pushing pouches. And I know all of you have seen them. There's beautiful commercials. They swear they're organic. But again, if you look closely at the ingredients, it's mostly applesauce or carrots. Those are cheap and sweet and addicting. So my goal is to really help the new mama out there understand the critical piece to chewing and how that literally lays the foundation to healthy eating and healthy talking. So to me, pouches are never, ever a good choice. The other piece that I've pulled back on, I've adjusted over the last couple of years, is the highly processed, again, commercialized baby cookie or biscuit as a first food. They have marketed that thinking, oh, this is a great way to chew. Yes and no. Again, it's a highly processed food. There's no nutritional value in it. And yes, it gives a munch response and they feel the texture in it. So that could be a plus. The only way that you could use those, again, is as an introduction. But what I'm suggesting there are other ways to get that chewing down and developed in a more purposeful, mature, what we call rotary grind with real food, and then object play. And object play could be with rattles and toys, teethers, all of those other kinds. If they're still needing stimulation, and they will probably until 12, 14, 16 months of age, depending on the child. But between 6 months and 12 months, it's going to be supplemented. So you're going to practice chewing and strengthening that jaw through actual eating and then oral or object play. So again, some of the basics. Start with julienne strips. Those are the best. And yes, we can teach with the spoon. And in another episode, I'll talk about the fine motor of the hand and the fingers and how that corresponds with the fine motor development in the mouth. But use julienne strips. Cook your vegetables and fruit. Or if it's a really ripe fruit, then peel it. Cut it in julienne strips about the size of your adult pinky, right? The width and the length, just big enough for them to hold on to it. They don't necessarily have a good let go of yet. And so they're going to hold on to it and really just put the whole thing in the mouth and then not realize that there's more food in there. Sometimes they'll eat on the other end too, but they don't have that fine motor control to release yet. But make sure it's al dente because, again, part of the introduction to that biting is that they have to get some kind of feedback from it. They have to have some proprioceptive. That means, how do I feel with my body in space somewhere? So inside that mouth, that tongue and cheek and lips are feeling that food. And so they're getting feedback and trying to orient in their brain mapping. This is different than the rattle. The rattle didn't break off. The rattle didn't have flavor. The rattle didn't give me kind of this sensation of it tastes good. So make sure that you're choosing foods that have some kind of density to it. That's why we stay far away from purees. We've just, I think, slipped down this slippery slope over the last, I'd say 20, 30 years. When the juice boxes came out in the 80s, I saw the writing on the wall. But I just think it's really critical that parents, because I can't tell you how many 3, 5, 7, 9-year-olds I met that could not chew their food well. And we'll talk about what some of those symptoms are. But the basics are really to skip the purees, really embrace the messiness of this introductory exploration phase, use julienne strips, and then we'll talk about what the mechanics are of chewing. The other thing is, if you do want to mash up some sweet potatoes or parsnips or carrots, make it chunky. So when they do put some in their mouth, one, they can hold on to it, or you begin to use the spoon that you, in the beginning, will preload, and then because it's hard for them to do that. But the puree, again, is something that they can dunk and then get the flavor off. But if you do smash it, make sure, again, there's some density to it. There's some weight. They can feel it inside their mouth and go, okay, what do I do with that? I also want to put a caution. Part of these basics is caution against pasta. And I know a lot of you are going, what does that mean? It's because, again, here in America, we have highly processed pasta. And even if you get whole wheat or you get some of the vegetables in it, it's small enough, it's slippery enough, they don't chew it. And our goal is to get your son or daughter to chew, and I'll explain how the dots are connected. If you have a weak chewer, It's risk for having weak speech and articulation, but there are other complications that I will help you see. So be mindful, choose good fatty meats that are healthy, some roast beef, some chicken thigh, not chicken breast. That's too dry. They can't really, we need fatty meats with juice and flavor. Choose a lot of good high fat, avocado, egg. You can do some sweet potatoes. You can do some vegetables with some good butter, right? So all of those different flavors and textures will help them broaden their awareness to what the possibilities are at your dinner table. Also, it's really smart of all of us to feed your baby what the rest of the family is eating, because that becomes a slippery slope too. And in other episodes, I've talked about that, and I will continue to talk about how do you navigate that? How do you take your meal and make it baby friendly for those first 3-4 months? As they're approaching their first birthday, you'll see that their chewing and their safety behind it is mature enough that they can pretty much eat what you're eating. Okay, so the mechanics of chewing. The first thing is it's always about our jaw. And so as a speech language therapist, when a child would come into me or come into my office, if they had speech delay or late talker or they're drooling or any of those kinds of things, the first thing I look at is their facial features, their structure, and that jaw. If they're an open mouth breather, if they're drooling, if they are a thumb sucker, all of those things are telltale signs that they're having jaw issues. And the jaw, quite early on in 6, 7, 8 months, in that very beginning, you'll see that if they're progressing in the natural path, then they'll be able to close their lip and kind of chew a couple of times or munch down. We call that munching, and then swallow it. Their lips and their cheeks are coordinated enough and strong enough to hold that seal so they can kind of move that food in their mouth just a little bit in the beginning. It's not a full rotary grind and mature swallow pattern. But in the very beginning, as he introduces the spoon or you help him, right? It's baby-led weaning, which means that you're helping guide the orientation to the mouth, but he's actually putting the food in his own mouth. And we'll talk about why. But it's really that as the food is slowly introduced to him, he will push it out with his tongue. That's called a tongue extrusion. So that's a reflexive protective mode. No, I don't, this is foreign, right? And then you're going to encourage him to do it. And you'll see pretty quickly on within the first few weeks that reflex that to push out should dissipate. It should also dissipate if you take these Julienne strips and you place it on their gum line, their molar gum line, right? Where the teeth are dying to erupt. And the more he chews, both on appropriate chew toys and real food, the more those teeth will erupt. And we know this for sure, both as speech pathologists, orthodontists, and dentists. As he understands and gets experience feeling food cross his lips and touch that tongue, then he'll naturally close his lips around that spoon and take it off. And that's what we want. Remember also that the hand and the mouth are really closely linked at this age. That's why they mouth everything. That's how they're collecting the data. And so it's best when he's in charge of bringing whatever's in his hand to his mouth. And then what happens is they'll learn how to anticipate, and both the jaw and the tongue will hold still, anticipating something's going to come in my mouth. And if we do that, it's too hit and miss. There's a disconnect between the food coming at me and those higher order sensory perceptions. And so it's really important that this whole baby-led weaning methodology or framework is understood, and not just because, oh, it's nice and polite, which it is, but it's also cognitively and sensory building for him or her. So the other piece is that a mature swallow, and that's where they have that rotary grind that you and I do, where our lips are closed and our jaw rotates and our tongue is able to sweep, or we call it a transverse reflex, where your tongue turns sideways and collects the food and puts it back into a little ball so we can continue to chew or masticate, right? And so you'll begin to see some of that rotary grind chewing going on right around 12 months if they've had enough opportunity between 6 and 12 months with a wide variety of foods. Again, another reason to omit pureed baby foods. It's not nutritious. It's way too expensive. They get hooked on it. It's an easy, quick fix. And then we're all kind of fallen into a trap. So I want to avoid that trap for you. Even the most mindful families have said, wow, I would have just gone straight to solid foods if I knew I had to then wean them off of pureed foods. It's an extra step that's totally unnecessary. Okay. So part of that maturing is that you'll see that they can start to collect a little bit of that food with that transverse reflex between 6 and 8 months. And you'll begin to see that. All of these things are emerging. It's a process. They need a lot of practice, daily practice, right? And so you can also expedite that or support that, encourage that with chew toys. And down below, I'll have a couple of links to some of my favorite providers, ARC therapy, talk tools, and those kinds of things that can really be helpful, that in non-eating time, or as I said, you can even use it as a precursor to learning how to use the spoon. But let's talk about the gag reflex, because I know that's the number one concern that you parents have, rightfully so. But there's so many nuances to it that if you can wrap your mind around the difference between what a gag is versus choking is horrible. Choking is also silent. So that's another perfect reason for you, mom, dad, grandparents, to be present and share the meal with them. And so it's really important that you can help them through any kind of gag. And that's a natural reflex that we have to protect us. You and I have a gag still today. But with your baby at 6, 8, 10 months old, what happens is the gag is pretty far up on the tongue, right? So if this is your tongue, it's in that first 1/3. But over those first several weeks, those first couple of months, the more he puts things in his mouth and feels around, whether it's the spoon or a chew toy or real food that he's masticating and playing and munching around, then what happens is that gag reflex moves further and further back. And so by the time that they hit 9-ish months, 6 to 9, actually, in some babies, that gag reflex can be on the back 1/3. So they can put that spoon in their mouth and they can take the food and chew it up without gagging. And you and I have a gag reflex, but it's at the back 1/4. So we can put a bigger piece of food and chew it up without gagging. But the only way that we can desensitize and pull that gag reflex back naturally on the tongue is through experience. And so that's why they need a lot of oral motor play, a lot of good eating opportunities to desensitize that. So it's okay. They're going to gag. But the more you do it consistently, day after day, you'll see it'll be less and less. And as long as you're staying cool, calm, and collected when you're sharing this meal with them, then they'll just cough it up. And sometimes they spit it up, and that's okay. You just act nonchalant and wipe it off and say, yeah, let's do it again. Let's chew slowly. And we'll talk about how to model that. Okay. So as I always say here, especially in those first 3 years, 5 years, everything is emerging. It happens over time. So it's going to be messy. Embrace the mess and embrace the independence that they will develop over these first few months. So the key is helping them understand that you can take a bite of something in the beginning or in the front of the mouth, but that's not the best way to bite. The biting is really on the molars. So you can take that Julienne strip food and put it on your molar or on their molar. And in the very beginning, you can even take a smushy food. So all of these foods, like I talked about, the sweet potato, the roasted meat, they all have to be smushable between your fingers, because think of if you can smush it between your fingers, he or she can smush it between their gums, right? That gum ridge. And the more they smush down on appropriate play objects and real food, then the freer that gum line will dissipate and the teeth will erupt. That's the only way. And that's another big question is, parents ask, how can they eat if they have no teeth, especially molars, right? They'll cut their front teeth. And so they think that they just can eat up front, but it's critical for the teeth. And we've seen it hundreds of times that the teeth will slowly erupt if they're still delayed on pureed foods. Another reason to skip that. Okay, so that munching will be between 6 and 9, and there'll be some rotary grind chewing but the critical piece is that you, mama and dad and grandparent, whoever's having this meal and you're sharing this meal, you see steady progress, that the lips are closed, they're trying to chew it, and that there's intentional exploration with the food in their mouth and with the objects, that they're really building whatever I'm grabbing and putting in my mouth. I'm really getting a mental and sensory perception understanding, right? And so the more that they do object and toy play, that they eat and drink, and vocalization, so cooing up until about 7 or 8 months, and then they really start babbling, and babbling means that they're putting different sounds together. The ba, 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 ga, da, 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 all of those different motor planning come into play because they're becoming more and more aware, proprioceptive. How do I move this jaw and lip and tongue, and how do they move independently from one another? So the other key mechanism to early eating and chewing are what we call mirror neurons. So the mirror neurons are critical for movements as well as social communication, social interactions. Again, another reason to share the meal or the snack, this food experience with your little one, because they're going to do whatever you do. They will follow you, not only purposefully, but we want that to happen within the first couple of months. But in the beginning, they have those mirror neurons, which is found here in between the frontal lobe and your parietal. And they're there to help the baby learn how to engage, that we don't do it. It's like if I yawn, you yawn. And that's part of the last remaining mirror neurons. But if you start chewing, they'll start chewing. If you're happy and smiling as you're enjoying this piece of meat, they'll be happy and smiling. They're going to follow our movement and social interaction. That's what mirror neurons help us with. So the other piece, part of this mechanism, but the social component to it, is that babies don't want to do what everybody else is doing, especially around 10 or 12 months. If you just set them down and, oh, here, honey, you eat your dinner first, and then we're going to have a nice quiet dinner over here later after I put you down. They're not interested in that. But 6 months, maybe. But by the time they're 9, 10, 12 months especially, they're like, heck no, I want to do what everybody else is doing. I don't want to be special. And so if you're not sitting down with them, they're not going to be interested in eating. Simple. They're just not. Because you guys are doing stuff or taking it to the next level, and they're not a part of that. And they're frustrated. They're like, no, I'm a family member too. And so it's really important to bring them in. I know that what happens is then we have to eat dinner earlier, but that's just temporary. It's just for a couple of years. Actually, it would be good to eat dinner earlier anyways for a long while, but that's another conversation. So what are the eating skills that are important, or why are these eating skills so important for this jaw development that supports a healthy nutritional relationship with food and good speech, language, and attention? So that's key too. That's an extra little bonus. So the jaw strength develops along with the jawbone growth. So there's a big muscle, it's called the masseter muscle, that will open and close this lower jaw. That's what moves, right? And through experience or exercise, just like walking or climbing the stairs or learning how to ride your bike, they have to do it. And so to build this jaw strength, which then leads to stability, which then leads to coordination, and what we also call is grading, we need the jaw to move in these tiny little increments for speech, and then also alignment. And if we have this, the strength, the coordination, and alignment, then at rest, or whenever the baby is not mouthing toys or eating or talking, then their lips should be closed and they should be breathing through their nose. And in the next video, and you'll find it right up here as soon as we attach them, the next video will talk all about nasal breathing and the critical development to that for your baby and toddler and child and adult, right? It's a lifelong issue, and it's become an epidemic for a lot of reasons. And if we can talk about the food choices as well, that will lessen the problems that could lead to that. So if we have a strong jaw, we're able to chew, our lips are closed, and we have nasal breathing at rest, then we're going to have a lot of healthier outcomes. So the other part of the jaw health is that then the lips and the cheek and the tongue can move independently from that jaw. Again, helping develop that rotary grind, chew, and swallow pattern, as well as speech and what we call co-articulation, stringing a bunch of sounds together and rattling off a sentence. So the other piece about lip closure is that at rest, if our lips are closed, if I'm just sitting here working on the computer or driving in the car and not talking to myself, then the back teeth, your molars, are almost touching, but there's just enough space. We always say that you could put a piece of paper right through it. That is just a whisper. And then the tongue is resting on the roof of the mouth. Now, some of us who have had orthodontia might not hit all the way there, and we have to consciously put it up there or in our swallow pattern. But what we want for your baby is at rest to have that, because I've shared in the past, both on this podcast and in my daily practice, that we swallow close to 2,000 times a day. And that's 5 pounds of pressure per swallow. And so if our swallow is weak and we're pushing it forward, we're not shaping that hard palate. And the hard palate, if you run your tongue on the roof of your mouth, and then there's that soft palate, right, that closes when we swallow. If that hard palate is the roof of your mouth, but it's also the floor of your nasal cavity. And so that shape, if it ends up being too pitched because the tongue has it pushed against it day after day and week after week and year after year, then you're going to have a high, narrow palate, and it's going to impede in your nasal cavity. And then you're going to have less airspace or less space to breathe the air through. And then you get a teeny tiny little allergen or cold or sniffle or animal fur or whatever. And then it doesn't take much to occlude and plug up your nose. And then if you plug up your nose, then you have to breathe through your mouth. And then that's where that vicious cycle happens. And so if we have good jaw strength through chewing and playing with appropriate objects and talking and singing and cooing and babbling and all of that, then this jaw stability is going to help literally support all of this other healthy growth and development. But the key is that chewing must be taught. And I want you to understand that you have to, I go back to my 3 Ps all the time, that parenting is about being present, being purposeful, and being playful. And so how you can do that is to literally show them how to take that bite and chew. And it's not a quick chomp, chomp, swallow me down, even though in the very beginning they're going to do that. So that's why you want to limit the number of choices, right? You have 3, 4, maybe 6 pieces, depending. But in the beginning, just give them 3 pieces. And you teach them by using those mirror neurons how to bite off a piece of that meat or that sweet potato, that avocado. And if you really dig down deep into the biology of chewing and mastication and health, how do we get the most nutrients out of the food that we eat, is you and I as adults should be chewing 30 or 40 times. Some people say even 60, but I've gone through phases in my life where I've practiced chewing 30 times each bite. It takes a lot more time. It's a little bit more exhausting. You do self-regulate more because you're more in tune with whether you're full or not. You appreciate the food much more. And you're starting the whole digestive process in your mouth with your saliva and the whole chewing process, right? Before you even swallow it. But that's another reason why ultra processed foods, the fake crackers, the baby cookies, all of this stuff that these baby companies have pushed on us in the market are not serving, because as soon as they get wet in your mouth, it turns to mush. And the goldfish crackers, all of that stuff, one, it's not nutritious. They're empty calories. They're very addicting. I mean, you and I have all sat and ate a bag of chips or crackers or cookies, and it does not serve your child in support of helping him learn how to chew. And it's never really satisfying. I mean, we get a quick hit in our dopamine because it's like, it could be salty or extra sweet, but it's not nourishing any of us, especially your baby or your toddler. So my big push is in baby-led weaning is to be very careful to exclude those items as much as humanly possible. And so some of the symptoms, and I've roughly identified them before, but if there is excessive drooling, so one of the key things when a family would walk into my office, and if they were a drooler, right, I would talk to the parents, but if their shirt was all wet all the time, that means they can't even manage their own saliva. And again, when your baby isn't eating or talking or playing or singing with objects, and when they're at rest, look at them in the back seat of your car. And if they're at rest or if they're sleeping, then they can spontaneously elicit that swallow of their own saliva. But if they're chronic droolers, yes, your body will produce a little bit more saliva when they're cutting a tooth, but that should only be a day or two. When a tooth is erupting, if they have enough practice with chew toys and real food and a lot of jaw exercises, then those teeth will erupt in a matter of a few days. I mean, once you see it come to surface. And that's when you give them those chew toys. And again, I'll have the link below. But it's really important that if your baby is an extra drooler and they even have a rash here, then you have to look at why. Step back, be an observant, be a detective. Do they have a chronic stuffy nose? Why do they have a chronic stuffy nose? Is it perhaps dairy? That's always the first thing that I suggest to parents is just remove that from their diet and see how they respond. Because that's often an easy fix, right? Or is it that they have low muscle tone in their jaw? They're not very good chewers yet. And so they have a relaxed jaw. And so that tongue, if the jaw is relaxed, then the tongue is depressed. It can't elicit that swallow reflex that you and I hopefully have, right? At rest, that if we need to swallow, we can do it, right? We push up against the roof. There's a wave-like motion with the tongue. And so extra drooling, a little bit here and there, is typical when the teeth are erupting. Snoring is another huge red flag. It's not even a yellow flag. Snoring is not normal, typical, healthy, should not be expected. Once or twice a year, perhaps, if they have a true full-blown cold, yes. And I tend to question when parents are, and I think parents say this because this is what pediatricians tell them, if they are then sent to a daycare or preschool, oh, they're just constantly getting sick. Well, that's also telling me something. Yeah, to get a cold or two, but to have one back to back, season to season, that's not typical or healthy either. And so it's important that you look at the food choices that you're giving. And I know that's hard, and we'll talk about daycare and preschool settings and their food choices. It's all processed and it's really and high sugar, and it's not nutrient dense, but we need to figure out, why is he chronically sick? That's not typical. And again, I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not a nutritionist, but I have 35 years of perspective looking at this group of the 1 to 3 year olds or 1 to 5 year olds. And I had to convince my daughter when she went off to college to remind her that as a child, those first 6, 7 years, she never, ever had a cold. I mean, she would maybe get sniffles here and there, but never like a full-blown cold. And she was like, I can't believe that. Isn't that what everybody has to experience? Chronic nasal congestions and snotty noses and all of that. And I'm like, no, you need a healthy immune system. You need good nasal breathing. And we'll talk more in detail about that in another episode. But that's how this is all related. The other symptoms could be if they have if they have thumb or finger sucking, they need more chewing stimulation. If that's also a way to self-calm. So if we give them enough stimulation in their object play and they're eating and they're talking and singing, they have their jaw worked out enough, then they will not need their thumb or their shirt. The other thing is those kids that stuff their mouth. And that's another big aha moment when parents will look at me and said, I had no idea. I just thought all kids just overstuffed, or they think it's funny, or in time they'll learn how to do that. We have to teach them. And that's where we only give them, say, 3 pieces. We model how we take a bite, close our lips, and chew it with intention. And if you overstuff your food, then we're going to give you 1 piece at a time, right? And teach them how to chew. And so if you have a 1 or a 2 or 3-year-old that's really stuffing their mouth, then you, again, be an observant, be a detective, and see what happens when you just give them 1 piece or 1 typical mouthful, and see where their chewing is. See if they can chew with their lips closed. See if they have that rotary grind chew yet, or parts of it. See if they can model. Quite often when I was in private practice and I was doing chewing therapy, I would chew with the child and count on my fingers, and it would be a game, like all the way to 10. And they would think it's funny. And parents need to do this. They need to understand that you just don't shove food in your mouth. One of the clinical symptoms or clinical impressions when I am faced with a child who stuffs a lot of food in their mouth, typically that's saying to me that they have a low proprioceptive or a low sensory system inside their oral cavity, inside their mouth. So they need more weight, or they need to fill the whole cavity up with food so they can feel it. Because if they just have a little piece, they can't orient it. Where is it in my mouth? And that's that whole proprioceptive, like, where is my body in space? And so your tongue is that only muscle in your body that has a point of origin back here and no point of insertion. So that's how it can collect this food and help us with that swallow or produce that swallow. And so if you're stuffing your mouth with food, 1, that's a gag and a choking hazard. And 2, his behavior is telling us, I have low tone. And so give them something chewy, say a really al dente piece of broccoli or a piece of meat. That would be good to chew on. And if they're a little bit older and they can handle raw vegetables like a carrot, and see if they can really chew it up, or even a cucumber that requires some mastication that doesn't just slide down their throat like pasta or goldfish crackers. You don't really have to chew goldfish crackers. What I've done, and I've seen hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of kids, you just put the goldfish cracker in their mouth, get it wet, push it up against the roof of their mouth, swallow it down. It's just, there's no chewing involved, right? And so be observant, be a detective, figure out where is my child on this whole continuum, on this journey, and how can I explicitly show them how to take a bite. And you can practice this on your own. Take a bite on your molar, close your lips, chew it in your mouth. Figure out, what's my tongue doing inside there to chew. How does my jaw feel as I rotary grind? It goes in a side-by-side movement, and then the tongue turns on its side corners. And we know that this tongue pattern, to have that rotary grind and to clear off your back teeth, like that's another kind of little test we would do. Like if you had food stuck on your back teeth, can your child retract the tongue and use the tip of the tongue to clear off? That same motor pattern, that strength, coordination, and purposeful movement is equivalent to what we need to say the R, like rabbit and mother, in English. And so that whole oral motor pattern and movement is the same that we need for the R production, which is later on, but you'll see it emerging around 3 or 2.5. And then the R is one of the hardest sounds to really master because not to get off track, but it acts as a consonant like in rabbit or rock or red. And then it acts like a vowel, like in mother or brother, that kind of thing. And those are typically harder, but that whole oral motor movement pattern is very similar to what we do when we have a mature rotary grind that you should see, I don't know, 50, 60% of the time by their second birthday. It should be emerging up through their first birthday, and then full mastery all the time, good jaw strength and coordination, good eating by their third birthday. So it's a process. It's an emerging learning process, oral, motor, and social around dinner time and lunchtime and all of that. So be cautious about, or be purposeful, I guess is a better word, about using baby-led weaning framework, selecting your food, understanding that the more opportunities I help him with in chewing from the get-go and avoiding the whole slippery slope of pureed foods, then they'll improve and desensitize that gag reflex, and the chances of choking is minimal to none. And that you start with that al dente or mechanically soft foods so they get some feedback, and then you help move them through the chewing process by modeling using those mirror neurons, but also that social engagement. They're going to want to spend time with you and share this meal with you. And to slow down and chew 20, 30, 40 times. That would be good for all of us to do. And actually, this past 6-7 months, that's what I've been practicing. And the truth is, I do feel I do feel sated in my meals and much more appreciative. And I can self-regulate. Am I full yet? And it's not a mental game. And sometimes it's like, okay, I'm tired of chewing. But if you are dealing with a delicious meal, and if it starts to not be delicious anymore, then that's your body, that's your satiety saying, okay, I'm done. I've had enough. And that's a good way to teach them when to stop eating, and that they don't have to clear off everything off their plate. And so that's another big important piece to this healthy eating development. So thanks so much for sharing your time with me. I hope this helps clear some of that fog, like, oh my gosh, I have to also teach them how to chew. Yep. And it's a win-win. It's a win for you. It's a win for them. And it will gain their independence faster and alleviate some of that picky eating. And they'll still be picky. That's not that uncommon for that 2 or 3-year-old, but it'll be a shorter, less traumatizing for the whole family. I assure you. And I've had a ton of successes with that, including my own daughter. And so remember, it's a domino effect that if you have a weak jaw because of lack of chewing and lack of oral motor practice and play and exploration, then it's going to cause a whole domino of issues, of health issues, of learning issues, of sleep issues, of attention issues. The gamut runs big and wide. And so please be thoughtful and careful and try it. Try practice chewing with your child and see how much fun it is. All right. Catch you next time. Thanks.